Greetings world, this is Eliyah Israel aka Young Chi. And what I want to do in this video is take a scientific approach to the spiritual idea of enlightenment. And the reason why I want to do this is because I would like to see a lot of spiritual concepts being taught, a lot of these spiritual concepts being taught in school curriculum, so that the younger generation, when they grow up, they'll have a better connection to their God self. And one way to do that, I think, is to be able to explain these things in a scientific form, so that we can have a better understanding of what it is that we're actually learning in school in connection to our spiritual experience. Because, when dealing with spirituality, or when dealing with science, science has a lack of meaning without the spiritual experience that goes along with it. A lot of scientists who made discoveries and breakthroughs and advancements, they were having a spiritual experience. And that's one thing that I would like to see be taught to the younger generation, so that they'll be more equipped when they step out into this world to have a better understanding of themselves, and in turn a better understanding of the world around them. So to begin, I started off doing research on cells and plasma. But I'm gonna start off with cells. So going back to junior high school biology, we were taught that cells were the basic building blocks of matter, or our physical bodies. And now here's the interesting thing is, for humans, our cells are what they call eukaryotic, which means that they have a nucleus. There are other beings or other organisms that exist that don't have a nucleus, but right now I'm going to talk about just the human cell. So the human cell has a nucleus, and the nucleus is kind of like the brain of the cell, which carries information and the data that processes in order for the cell to know what it's supposed to be doing. Each cell also has its own digestive system, along with respiratory system. So one way that I like to look at it, and this is, getting to the spiritual part, is every time we inhale, I like to look at it as our cells also inhaling. Now, how it all synchronizes if, every cell is inhaling or taking in that oxygen, because our cells need oxygen in order to be able to function. And I believe that as we inhale, our blood becomes oxygenated. In turn, our cells become oxygenated. And I believe that I think it's carbon dioxide that our cells release as like their waste product, and that they release to the bloodstream. And as we exhale, that carbon dioxide leaves out of our body. So our cells are kind of like miniature versions of us. That's the way I like to look at it. And I'll get a little bit into that a little bit later. But each cell has a memory. And so when you think about like our ancestors, we carry the cells of our ancestors, the cells and the genetics of our ancestors from thousands and probably millions of years ago that exist within us. We're still carrying that genetic code. Now it changes as we evolve, and I'll probably talk about that a little bit later. It changes, but remember that we carry those cells which carry the information and memories of our ancestors. Now, I'll probably get into that in another video where we talk about more spiritual practices. With connection to our ancestors. But right now, let me stay focused on cells. So each cell has its own respiratory system, digestive system, and nucleus. Now, like I said, each cell is kind of like a miniature version of us that exists within our body. And each cell communicates. It has a plasma membrane, and it communicates and sends signals and information through a network that's called the endoplasmic reticulum. And I guess I'll get a little bit more into that once I start talking about plasma. But that's the way that our cells send signals through this network. And it's I guess it's like chemicals that are released, and those chemicals carry signals that let each cell know what the other cell is trying to say. And I think that it corresponds to our nervous system and in relation to our brain. But I'm not really going to get too much into that right now. I'll probably do another research study on the nervous system and how it connects to our brain. But right now, let's stay focused on cells. So one way that I like to look at cells, and I think this will help, it's like an assembly that'll help to be able to get a good picture of how cells are in relation to our genetics. Now, each cell can be looked at as being like a library. And in our cells, our cells carry chromosomes. And each chromosome can be looked at as being like a book in the library. And then the chromosomes have DNA. And the DNA can be looked at as like the chapters in each book. And then within our DNA, there's our genetics. And the genetics can be looked at as like the words in each book. So what's interesting is that in modern science, scientists have made the discovery of how to be able to manipulate genetics in order to be able to create, or to artificially create things. And that's where you get into genetically modified organisms and food. You get into stem cell research with the production of artificial limbs and organs. Things of that nature, to where it's kind of like man playing God. Man being able to create things that, were taught spiritually that God created. You know how God created man? God created man and woman. God created, the earth, in 7 or 6 days. So these are like, spiritual things that we're taught, and it's kind of like in a simple way. But once we start looking at it scientifically, I think that it gives us a better understanding of what it is that we're actually being taught spiritually. And I think if we look at it spiritually, it'll give us a better understanding of how to, how to get an understanding of it from a scientific point of view. So that's a way that I like to look at cells, as being kind of like a library. Now, getting into our genetics, which is something else that I find pretty fascinating. One thing that I will say is, when you look at the root of genetics, you see the word jinn. Now, jinn, when you get into Islam, the jinn are looked at as spiritual beings that exist in the unseen world. And, in our culture, the jinn can also be kind of like related to the genie, how people call it genie. And also, some people say that the word genius stands for the genie that lives within us, which is kind of like, the godly presence that exists within us, that helps guide us, to, making advancements or creating bright ideas or things of that nature. So that's what's at the root of the word genetics. Now, so if you look at it, if we're looking at it from a spiritual point of perspective, the genetics that exist within us, if we're looking at it spiritually, relates to a jinn. So that's basically a spirit that exists within. And you may hear about someone who may be carrying the genetics of, they may be carrying the genetics of their family members, and, they come out looking like a family member or acting like a family member. And I think that corresponds to the spirit that's in our cells, which goes into our DNA and our genetics, that's coming out in the outward representation. I guess from being a dominant trait, or a dominant form that's existing in our code, in each individual's code. So that's a little bit about the genetics. Now, remember, well, some of us are taught like right around high school that about our DNA and genetics, and basically the genetics are broken down into a numeric code. Now, here's what's interesting when you start to get into culture, especially like ancient cultures and ancient Hebrew to be specific. Now, the ancient Hebrew language, there are other, a lot of ancient languages in general. they have symbols, and those symbols have an alphabetical and they have a numerical value. And this is one of the reasons why I think that ancient scientists and ancient cultures had a better understanding of their self and the world around them. And when I say that, I don't mean primitive man. And I think that that's a different story. But I'm talking about the ancient civilizations that were looked at as being gods that no longer exist, like ancient Egypt, some of the Native American, or they call like Mayans, Olmecs, and things like that. These are even getting to Atlantis and Lemuria. These are scientists that were looked at as almost like gods, or being gods here on Earth because of their specialized knowledge that they have of themselves and creation. So I'm not going to get too much into that right now, but I think that's something to keep in mind. Now, when dealing with the ancient language, the ancient Hebrew language in particular, there's a concept called the tetragrammaton. And the tetragrammaton is basically 4 symbols that come together that represent the name of God, the ancient name of God. And you may hear some people in the Hebrew culture that say Yahweh or Yahweh Yah. Yahweh is kind of like the contemporary form that people use, or the contemporary name that people use. But basically, it comes from the tetragrammaton, which is 4 symbols. The in modern Jewish is the Yod He Vah He, or in ancient Hebrew is Yahweh Yah, and basically it's really 3 symbols that there's an extra he or ha at the very end. And those 3 symbols not only have alphabetical and numerical values, but they also represent ideas. And these 3 symbols in particular correspond to elements on the periodic table, which are, for the Yod or the Yah, represents oxygen. The Ha or the He represents hydrogen, and the Wa or the Va represents nitrogen. Now, these 3 elements exist in the atmosphere. They exist in the air that we breathe. But what's so interesting is that these 3 elements also come together to form carbon. And if you may have been taught this in high school, that our physical beings are carbon based. So these 3 elements come together to form the physical being of our bodies, of our physical selves. So I think that that's very fascinating, because this here is an ancient name for God, which scientifically can be broken down into the elements that exist in the air that we breathe, that all around us in the atmosphere, but it also comes together to create our physical beings. And I think that that's very fascinating. That's something that I meditate on, like in my workouts and things like that. Because when you think of it, in the Bible it says like how God made man. And if you look at how man is today, from the sciences that we have right now, man is kind of like playing God.